Welcome, everyone. We are going to spend today talking about GCP, a review of GCP for those of you who have training in GCP. We'll also touch on some new processes, some of the things that we'd be looking for, maybe not new, but a different way of thinking with good clinical practice. If we are familiar with those regulatory requirements, that's fantastic, but there's a lot more that governs what we do in clinical research. We'll talk about some of the other regulatory bodies that are interested in what we do, some of the state and local laws that we need to consider, some of the key differences between our different investigational products. So we'll talk about the elements, too, of a functional quality system at the site level. We will look at the elements we expect to see to help meet those regulatory obligations, as well as those additional obligations of good clinical practice. Look at recent trends in noncompliance, the role of SOPs in GCP, why they're so critical for us, characterize the differences between the legal and procedural elements, because there are a lot of things that we see in the regulations that are, I don't want to say left up to interpretation, but we in the industry have done our best to try to develop tools to help meet those obligations, like delegation of authority logs, for example. We'll talk about the differences also in pharmaceutical device and biologics, just some high-level review of the different regulations and some other additional requirements we might want to consider when we are assessing our compliance with working with those different groups. So we talk about the common elements of good clinical practice. We have these regulatory requirements. For industry-sponsored research, we are working under Title 21 and the different parts. For our federally funded research, we'll be working under Title 45, CFR 46, or the Common Rule. So we often see this in terms of training, for example. People will use that NIH Human Subject Protection Training website and get their certificate, but understand that that training does not speak to these regulatory requirements that we need to be mindful of if we're conducting an IND or an IDE study. So 21 CFR Part 11 is in parentheses. The FDA has told us that they won't necessarily hold us accountable to this directly, but they will link it back to 312 or 812, which we'll discuss. 21 CFR Part 11 are electronic systems and electronic signatures. So if we have determined that we are going to use certain electronic systems during the course of our study to gather and disseminate data, then we need to make sure that that is a compliant system with the requirements for control and operation and oversight, linking it back to data integrity. So FDA has said that they will, again, not necessarily cite us to not having compliant systems, but they will cite us for failing to maintain adequate and accurate records. And we've seen that come through in warning letters to clinical investigators. For example, Dr. Nemechek got a warning letter because his computer crashed and he hadn't yet put all the data into the case report form and he hadn't retained or backed up that data. So when we think about the integrity of our data, it really touches on everything: our investigational product, our safety, our endpoint data, and our informed consent. So 21 CFR Part 50 is the process and document of informed consent. It's human subject protections through having a document that has all required elements of informed consent, as spelled out in 21 CFR Part 50, as well as making sure it is executed appropriately. So the person has had an opportunity and the investigator has an opportunity to obtain legally effective consent. 21 CFR Part 54. This is information about financial disclosure. So it is one quantifiable way that the FDA has for assessing the potential for bias or conflict of interest in clinical research. We know that we have to gather this information prior to the start of the study from the investigators, sub-investigators, with questions that reflect back on their spouses and dependent children. It is, as I said, quantifiable. It's money-driven. Do you have significant payments of other sorts or stock or equity interest? And we have cutoffs there. Beyond that, we need to be sharing that information. But we're also required to mitigate or manage any identified potential conflict. This also comes back to our data integrity. Everything is going to be built around making sure we're getting credible data from protected subjects. That is what good clinical practice is about. So do you have established electronic systems? Do you have access to the data because you've obtained legally effective consent? Are you working with investigators whose potential for bias has been mitigated? 21 CFR Part 54, this is financial disclosure. Part 56 is information regarding the structure and function of our institutional review boards. So if we are conducting industry-sponsored research, we need to make sure on the back of that IND, we talk about having an IRB that is responsible for initial and continuing review that is compliant with 21 CFR Part 56. So there's a lot that goes into assessing our IRBs. Are they compliant with Part 56 as opposed to 45 CFR 46? If all we are gathering from our IRBs is a federal-wide assurance number or an FWA number, we're just getting documentation from that IRB that they're going to be in compliance with 45 CFR 46.